Have you ever noticed how the harder you try to control everything, the more everything seems to slip out of your hands? Life has a strange, almost ironic way of teaching us its deepest lessons. The more tightly we try to manage every detail, the outcomes, the timing, the way people respond, the heavier everything begins to feel. What starts as careful planning slowly turns into pressure. We think ahead, we strategize, we try to stay one step ahead of uncertainty, and yet, instead of clarity, what we often find is tension. Instead of progress, there's resistance. Somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, we stop truly living and start managing everything, including our own sense of peace. The Stoics understood this deeply. They didn't see effort as the problem. Effort is necessary. Discipline is valuable. But the real issue lies in attachment, that quiet, almost invisible belief that things must go a certain way for us to feel okay. Marcus Aurelius wrote about accepting what unfolds, not as a form of weakness, but as a profound strength. Because the moment you stop fighting reality, something subtle but powerful begins to change. You stop wasting energy trying to control what was never yours to control in the first place. And in that space, something shifts. Your mind begins to settle. The constant pressure starts to loosen. Clarity, which once felt distant, slowly returns. And when that happens, life itself begins to move differently. Not because you forced it into place, but because you finally stopped resisting its natural flow. You can feel this tension building quietly, almost beneath the surface. It's that frustration of doing everything right, following the plan, staying disciplined, checking every box, and still not arriving where you expected. You prepare carefully. You stay committed. You do what's supposed to work. And yet, the result feels delayed, distorted, or sometimes completely absent. At first, it doesn't feel like a problem. In fact, it feels responsible. It feels like control. Like you're being intentional, careful, even wise. But slowly, almost invisibly, that intention begins to tighten. It becomes heavier. You start replaying conversations in your head. You question decisions you've already made. You adjust small details that didn't really need adjusting. You convince yourself that maybe, just maybe, one more change will finally unlock the outcome you've been chasing. But here's the paradox. The harder you try to fix everything, the more complicated everything becomes. What once felt simple is now layered with pressure. You're no longer just acting, you're calculating. You're no longer moving forward, you're trying to manage every possible outcome in advance. And that shift changes everything. The process stops feeling natural. It starts to feel forced, and that force creates friction. Not physically, but mentally. Your mind doesn't rest. It keeps scanning, adjusting, anticipating, as if life were some system that could be perfected if you just thought hard enough. But life doesn't open up under pressure. It resists it. And this is where one of the most important misunderstandings begins. Effort is not the problem. Discipline is not the problem. The real issue arises when effort quietly transforms into control. Effort stays grounded. It focuses on what you can do right now, in this moment. Control, on the other hand, reaches beyond that. It tries to manage outcomes that haven't happened yet. It tries to predict reactions, secure certainty, and shape the future before it even arrives. And in doing so, it pulls you away from what's actually in front of you. You stop being present with your actions because your mind is already busy trying to secure a future that isn't guaranteed. And that's where the tension comes from. Not from doing too much, but from trying to hold on to something that was never yours to hold. Over time, this begins to affect everything. Even progress stops feeling satisfying. You achieve something, but instead of appreciating it, your mind immediately moves to the next concern. Is it enough? Is it happening fast enough? What if it doesn't lead where it's supposed to? That constant evaluation quietly drains the meaning out of everything you do. Growth starts to feel like pressure. Effort begins to feel like obligation. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, everything becomes heavier than it actually is. There's a quiet truth hidden in all of this. When you try to control too many variables at once, you don't gain clarity. You lose it. Your attention becomes scattered. Your decisions become reactive. You start second-guessing instincts that once felt natural and clear, not because they were wrong, but because you've layered too many expectations on top of them. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips away. And yet, the instinct remains the same. Grip harder, think more, control everything. But that instinct is exactly what creates the problem. That's why feeling stuck isn't always about a lack of movement. In many cases, it's the opposite. It's the result of too much internal interference. You are moving, but not cleanly. You are acting, but not freely. There's always that extra layer of pressure shaping every decision, every thought, every step forward. And that pressure quietly disconnects you from the natural rhythm of progress. And that's exactly where we left off, caught in that subtle but constant pressure that quietly pulls you away from the natural rhythm of progress. Because real progress isn't just about taking action. It's about alignment. It's about being fully present with what you're doing, without constantly trying to force it into a specific result. Think about that for a moment. How often are you truly focused on the action itself, rather than the outcome it's supposed to produce? Beneath all of this, there's usually a deeper belief driving the tension. A belief that if you don't stay in control, everything will fall apart. That if you relax, even slightly, you might miss your chance. That somehow, everything depends on how tightly you manage every detail. It feels responsible. It feels necessary. But if you look closer, that belief doesn't come from clarity. It comes from fear. It assumes that your power lies in controlling outcomes, when in reality, your true power lies in how you show up to the process itself. And when that truth gets overlooked, something important happens. Control quietly replaces trust. You begin to rely on force instead of confidence in your own ability to respond. And trust, that steady, grounding force, is exactly what disappears when everything starts to feel overwhelming. Marcus Aurelius captured this simply. You have power over your mind, not over external events. The moment you step beyond that boundary, you begin to lose stability. And the more energy you spend trying to control what was never yours to control, the weaker you become in the one place that actually matters, your own mind, your own actions. If something in this way of thinking is starting to shift inside you, stay with it. Let it sink in. Build on it. Because this isn't just about motivation. It's about training your mind to remain clear, steady, and grounded, no matter what life throws your way. And when you begin to see this clearly, something starts to change. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but gradually. You begin to notice something you may have missed before. Much of your stress doesn't come from what you're doing. It comes from what you're trying to control beyond that. You start to see the difference between acting with intention and acting under pressure. And that awareness creates something incredibly valuable. Space. Space to step back. Space to breathe. Space to return to a way of moving that feels natural again, instead of forced. Because the truth is, nothing you're chasing responds well to tension. Have you ever tried to rush something important, only to make it worse? But things respond very differently when you move with clarity, focus, and just enough detachment to let them unfold without gripping too tightly. There's a moment, and you've probably felt it, where everything starts to feel heavier than it should. Not because you're doing too much, but because you're holding on to too much that was never yours to carry in the first place. At first, it goes unnoticed. You replay timelines in your head. You imagine how things should happen, when they should happen. You tell yourself this is just part of being responsible, part of succeeding. But slowly, the weight builds. Not because life is asking more from you, but because you're trying to manage things that don't belong to your control. And that's where the real shift begins. Quietly, almost invisibly, You move from acting with clarity into thinking with tension. And suddenly, everything starts to feel unstable, even when nothing around you has actually changed. It becomes clearer when you pause and really look at what is within your reach. Your actions, those are yours. The effort you choose to put in, the way you carry yourself, the consistency you commit to. These things are grounded, stable, and always available to you in every moment. But then, there are the other elements. How someone responds when an opportunity appears. Whether something you've worked on for weeks or months turns out the way you hoped. These things exist outside of you, shaped by variables you can't fully see, let alone control. And yet, these are exactly the things your mind clings to the most. It tries to predict them, shape them, secure them in advance. And when it can't, it reacts with tension. What's interesting is that this tension often disguises itself as care. It feels like you're simply invested, like you're taking things seriously. But there's a subtle, and critical, difference between caring about something and attaching your stability to it. The moment your emotional state begins to depend on how something turns out, you've crossed into a different space. Now your peace is no longer steady. It rises and falls with outcomes, with responses, with timing. You feel good when things align, and unsettled when they don't. And because those things are inherently unpredictable, your internal state becomes unpredictable too. It's not that you're doing something wrong. It's that you've tied something stable to something unstable, and the result is constant fluctuation. This is why the more tightly you fixate on a specific result, the more anxiety begins to grow. Not because the goal itself is the problem, but because of how tightly you're holding on to it. There's an invisible pressure that builds in the background, a quiet voice that keeps insisting, "This has to work. This has to happen now. This needs to go exactly as planned." And that pressure doesn't make you more effective. It does the opposite. And as we just saw, that invisible pressure doesn't help you move forward. It quietly works against you. "This has to happen now. This needs to go exactly as planned." That inner voice feels urgent, almost convincing. But the truth is, that kind of pressure doesn't make you more effective. It does the opposite. It narrows your thinking. It pushes you into reacting instead of responding with clarity. And over time, it drains your energy in a way that's hard to notice at first, because it's happening internally, not externally. What makes this even more challenging is how natural it feels. The mind is wired to seek certainty. It wants answers. It wants to know what's coming next, how things will turn out, whether all your effort will actually pay off. And when those answers aren't available, the mind doesn't just sit quietly. It starts creating them. It fills the unknown with assumptions, with expectations, with imagined scenarios that feel real enough to believe. But here's the problem. Those mental constructions don't create stability. They create attachment. And when that attachment is directed toward things outside your control, it becomes a constant source of tension. It's like trying to anchor yourself to something that keeps shifting beneath you. No matter how tightly you hold on, it never truly settles. This is where the Stoic perspective becomes incredibly practical. It doesn't tell you to stop caring. It doesn't ask you to give up your goals or withdraw from life. Instead, it draws a clear, almost simple line between what is yours and what isn't. It brings your attention back to the only place where your influence is real, the present moment, and the choices you make within it. Everything else, no matter how important it feels, exists outside that boundary. And when you begin to see that clearly, something starts to shift. Not necessarily in the world around you, but in how you relate to it. Epictetus expressed this idea in a way that seems simple at first, but reveals its depth over time. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. That distinction, when truly understood, removes an enormous amount of unnecessary pressure. It doesn't eliminate challenges. It doesn't guarantee outcomes. But it stabilizes your position within the process. It allows you to fully engage with what you're doing, without constantly reaching beyond it, searching for certainty that isn't available. And that changes everything. As this understanding begins to settle, your approach naturally evolves. You still take action, but it feels different now. There's less urgency, less strain. You're no longer trying to force results into existence. Instead, you focus on doing your part, clearly, consistently, and with intention. And when the outcome finally arrives, whatever it may be, it doesn't shake you the same way. Why? Because your stability was never tied to it in the first place. It was rooted in something far more reliable, your ability to act with clarity, no matter how things unfold. You can see this dynamic even more clearly in everyday interactions, especially in moments that feel important. Imagine someone walking into a conversation already carrying invisible pressure. They're trying to say the right thing, avoid saying the wrong thing, carefully measuring every word as if everything depends on getting it perfect. Inside, there's a constant dialogue running, analyzing tone, timing, reactions. Every pause feels meaningful. Every response feels like something to decode. On the surface, it might look like effort, like attention to detail, like someone who truly cares. But underneath, it's tension, and that tension doesn't stay hidden for long. It starts to show in subtle ways. The voice tightens slightly. The body language becomes less natural. The conversation feels just a little forced, even if the words themselves are fine. People may not consciously identify what's happening, but they feel it. There's a sense that something isn't flowing, not because the person lacks value, but because they're trying to manage how that value is perceived in real time. And the more they try to control that perception, the more unnatural everything becomes. It's not the words that create distance. It's the pressure behind them. Now compare that to someone else in the same situation. There's no visible effort to impress. No constant adjustment happening beneath the surface. They speak in a way that feels grounded, not rehearsed. They listen fully, without already planning what to say next. There's space in the interaction, a kind of ease that allows the moment to unfold naturally. And because of that, everything feels different. People respond with more openness. There's comfort. There's flow. The conversation moves without friction. And what stands out isn't any specific sentence they said. It's how they carried themselves while saying it. And that difference in energy, the one you can feel but not always explain, is where everything begins to make sense. It's easy to misunderstand it. You might look at that second person, the one who feels calm, natural, at ease, and assume they're simply more confident, more experienced, or somehow naturally better. But that's not the real difference. The real difference lies in their relationship to the outcome. They're not trying to control how they're perceived in every moment. They're not tying their sense of worth to how the interaction unfolds. There's no constant need to get it right in order to feel okay. And because of that, their attention stays exactly where it matters most, in the present moment, in the exchange itself. They're fully engaged, but they're not gripping tightly. And that subtle shift creates an entirely different experience, not just for them, but for the person they're interacting with as well. Carl Jung once suggested that what irritates us in others can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves. But this idea goes beyond irritation. It shows up in moments of comparison too. When you notice the contrast between tension and ease in others, it often reflects something unresolved within you. That urge to control how you're perceived, it usually comes from somewhere deeper. A fear of being misunderstood. A fear of being rejected. A fear of not being valued. And that fear quietly creates pressure. It pushes you to manage every detail, to anticipate every possible reaction, to stay one step ahead of anything that might go wrong. But in doing that, something important gets lost. You move away from authenticity. And as this pattern repeats, it begins to shape more than just individual conversations. It starts to influence how you show up in general. Conversations stop feeling like genuine exchanges and start feeling like performances. Relationships begin to feel like something you have to maintain through effort, rather than something that can grow naturally over time. And slowly, a sense of fatigue begins to build, not because connecting with people is exhausting by nature, but because trying to control how that connection unfolds requires constant mental effort. It becomes less about being present and more about managing impressions. But then something shifts, quietly, almost subtly, when you begin to let go of that need. And letting go doesn't mean you stop caring about how you show up. It simply means you stop trying to control how every moment is received. You begin to trust that your clarity, your presence, is already enough, without needing to constantly adjust it. And with that trust comes a different kind of stability. You're no longer reacting to every small change in the interaction. A pause doesn't throw you off. An unexpected response doesn't shake you. Things not going exactly as planned no longer feel like a problem. You remain grounded, even in uncertainty. And that grounded state changes how others experience you. There's less pressure in the interaction, which makes it easier for them to relax too. Communication becomes more natural, more open, more fluid. And interestingly, the very things you may have been chasing before, positive reactions, connection, approval, start to happen more easily, not because you're forcing them, but because the conditions for them are finally there. When there's no tension pushing against the interaction, nothing is blocking it from unfolding naturally. And what becomes clear through all of this is something simple, but powerful. Your value isn't something you need to constantly prove in real time. It's already there. It's expressed through how you carry yourself, not through how tightly you try to manage every detail. The moment you stop trying to control how you're perceived, you create space for something more genuine to emerge. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, changes everything. Because in the absence of pressure, both you and the people around you can finally engage without resistance. And that is where real connection begins. This is also where the idea of detachment often gets misunderstood. At first glance, it can sound cold, distant, almost like you're supposed to stop caring. But that's not what it means at all. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop tying your inner stability to how things turn out. It's a shift in where your emotional weight is placed. Instead of putting it on the result, you place it on how you show up. And that small shift changes everything, even if nothing on the outside looks different right away. There's an important distinction here, one that often goes unnoticed. The difference between wanting something and depending on it. Wanting allows space. It leaves room for movement, for adaptation, for growth. But depending closes that space. It creates pressure. It turns the outcome into something that feels necessary for your peace of mind. And when that happens, everything changes. Every delay starts to feel like something is going wrong. Every obstacle feels personal, like a setback that shouldn't be there. And without realizing it, you're pulled right back into that cycle of tension once again. And that difference in energy, the one you can feel but not always explain, is where everything begins to make sense. It's easy to misunderstand it. You might look at that second person, the one who feels calm, natural, at ease, and assume they're simply more confident, more experienced, or somehow naturally better. But that's not the real difference. The real difference lies in their relationship to the outcome. They're not trying to control how they're perceived in every moment. They're not tying their sense of worth to how the interaction unfolds. There's no constant need to get it right in order to feel okay. And because of that, their attention stays exactly where it matters most, in the present moment, in the exchange itself. They're fully engaged, but they're not gripping tightly. And that subtle shift creates an entirely different experience, not just for them, but for the person they're interacting with as well. Carl Jung once suggested that what irritates us in others can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves. But this idea goes beyond irritation. It shows up in moments of comparison too. When you notice the contrast between tension and ease in others, it often reflects something unresolved within you. That urge to control how you're perceived, it usually comes from somewhere deeper. A fear of being misunderstood. A fear of being rejected. a fear of not being valued. And that fear quietly creates pressure. It pushes you to manage every detail, to anticipate every possible reaction, to stay one step ahead of anything that might go wrong. But in doing that, something important gets lost. You move away from authenticity. And as this pattern repeats, it begins to shape more than just individual conversations. It starts to influence how you show up in general. Conversations stop feeling like genuine exchanges and start feeling like performances. Relationships begin to feel like something you have to maintain through effort, rather than something that can grow naturally over time. And slowly, a sense of fatigue begins to build, not because connecting with people is exhausting by nature, but because trying to control how that connection unfolds requires constant mental effort. It becomes less about being present and more about managing impressions. But then something shifts, quietly, almost subtly, when you begin to let go of that need. And letting go doesn't mean you stop caring about how you show up. It simply means you stop trying to control how every moment is received. You begin to trust that your clarity, your presence, is already enough, without needing to constantly adjust it. And with that trust comes a different kind of stability. You're no longer reacting to every small change in the interaction. A pause doesn't throw you off. An unexpected response doesn't shake you. Things not going exactly as planned no longer feel like a problem. You remain grounded, even in uncertainty. And that grounded state changes how others experience you. There's less pressure in the interaction, which makes it easier for them to relax too. Communication becomes more natural, more open, more fluid. And interestingly, the very things you may have been chasing before, positive reactions, connection, approval, start to happen more easily, not because you're forcing them, but because the conditions for them are finally there. When there's no tension pushing against the interaction, nothing is blocking it from unfolding naturally. And what becomes clear through all of this is something simple, but powerful. Your value isn't something you need to constantly prove in real time. It's already there. It's expressed through how you carry yourself, not through how tightly you try to manage every detail. The moment you stop trying to control how you're perceived, you create space for something more genuine to emerge. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, changes everything. Because in the absence of pressure, both you and the people around you can finally engage without resistance. And that is where real connection begins. This is also where the idea of detachment often gets misunderstood. At first glance, it can sound cold, distant, almost like you're supposed to stop caring. But that's not what it means at all. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop tying your inner stability to how things turn out. It's a shift in where your emotional weight is placed. Instead of putting it on the result, you place it on how you show up. And that small shift changes everything, even if nothing on the outside looks different right away. There's an important distinction here, one that often goes unnoticed. The difference between wanting something and depending on it. Wanting allows space. It leaves room for movement, for adaptation, for growth. But depending closes that space. It creates pressure. It turns the outcome into something that feels necessary for your peace of mind. And when that happens, everything changes. Every delay starts to feel like something is going wrong. Every obstacle feels personal, like a setback that shouldn't be there. And without realizing it, you're pulled right back into that cycle of tension once again. A gentle shift begins when you realize it's not just what happens, but how you interpret it that shapes everything. From that point, the idea of control takes on a much deeper meaning. It's no longer just about actions or outcomes. It moves inward, into interpretation itself. External events will always come and go, often without warning, often without fairness. They don't pause to ask for your permission, and they rarely align perfectly with your expectations. Life unfolds on its own terms. But there is something important hidden in all of this. The space between what happens and how you respond. That space belongs entirely to you. It's subtle, easy to overlook. Yet it's always there, quietly waiting. And within that space lies a powerful ability, the ability to decide how something is understood. Not in a forced or artificial way, but in a calm, deliberate way that allows clarity to emerge instead of immediate reaction. When that space is ignored, something else takes over. Thoughts begin to run automatically. A setback quickly turns into a final conclusion. A delay starts to feel like failure. A rejection becomes something personal, as if it defines who you are, rather than being just a single moment in time. And because these interpretations arise so quickly, so convincingly, they're rarely questioned. They settle it almost instantly. They shape your emotions. They influence your behavior. They reinforce patterns that quietly repeat themselves over and over again. Before long, it begins to feel as though reality itself is heavy. But if you look closely, much of that weight isn't coming from the event, it's being added internally. There's a powerful insight in this. The thoughts you don't notice, the assumptions that quietly run in the background, the interpretations that feel automatic, these are the forces shaping your experience. When they remain unexamined, they feel like truth. Fixed. Unchangeable. But the moment you begin to notice them, really notice them, something starts to shift. You don't immediately believe every thought that appears. You observe it. You question it. And slowly, the grip those thoughts once had begins to loosen. This doesn't mean negative thoughts disappear completely. They still arise. But now, you see them differently. A thought is no longer a final conclusion. It's just a mental event. It comes, it passes, and it only gains strength when it's accepted without question. And with that realization, your relationship with your own mind begins to change. Instead of being pulled in every direction by whatever thought appears next, you start to create a small distance. You observe instead of react. You choose instead of absorb. There's a subtle sense of separation, not disconnection, but awareness. As this awareness grows, something interesting happens. The same situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel more manageable. Not because the situations themselves have changed, but because your interpretation of them has. A challenge becomes something to navigate, not something to fear. A mistake becomes information, not proof of failure. There's a new sense of perspective, a steadiness that wasn't there before. You begin to see that your experience isn't shaped only by what happens, but by how you understand what happens. And this is where real power begins to take form, not in controlling circumstances, because those will always remain unpredictable, but in directing perception. That's where your influence truly lies. Even when everything around you feels uncertain, that inner space remains available. When you start using that space with clarity, everything begins to change. Situations that once drained you lose their intensity. Reactions that once felt instant begin to slow down. There's more room to breathe, more space to respond. And that doesn't mean disconnecting from reality or ignoring difficulty. It means engaging with reality without distorting it through immediate judgment. It means seeing things as they are, without layering them with assumptions that create unnecessary suffering. From that clarity, better decisions begin to emerge. Your actions become more intentional, more grounded. You're no longer reacting to the first thought that appears. Instead, you respond with a broader understanding of what's actually happening. Over time, this builds a kind of inner stability. Not the kind that depends on everything going perfectly, but the kind that remains steady even when things don't. You still feel. You still experience. But you're no longer carried away in the same way. And that difference, between feeling something and being controlled by it, becomes clearer the more you practice observing your thoughts instead of immediately identifying with them. It's a quiet shift. Almost unnoticeable at first. But it builds a kind of strength that force never could. And as that strength grows, something else begins to fade. And as that inner stability begins to grow, something subtle changes. The need to constantly label every moment starts to fade. That urge to interpret every situation as either a success or a failure slowly loses its intensity. There's less pressure to define everything instantly, less urgency to assign meaning to every single outcome. Instead, more space begins to open up. Space to simply experience. Space to reflect. Space to move forward without demanding that every moment justify itself. And within that space, your relationship with yourself starts to shift. It becomes steadier, less reactive, more grounded in something that isn't so easily shaken by external change. What remains is a clearer sense of where your true influence actually lies. Not in forcing outcomes. Not in controlling every external detail. But in how you meet each moment as it arrives. That's where the real transformation happens, quietly, steadily, without needing attention or recognition. And once it begins, it doesn't just change how you think, it changes how you move through everything that follows. But then comes the part that truly tests everything you've understood so far. It's not action. It's not discipline. It's not even clarity. It's patience. Not the kind that feels rewarding. Not the kind that gives you immediate reassurance. But the kind that asks you to sit with uncertainty, without reaching for control as a way to escape it. The kind that feels uncomfortable precisely because nothing seems to be happening. Because even after you've done the work, even after you've adjusted your mindset and loosened your grip on outcomes, there's still that quiet voice in the background. The one that whispers, "Why isn't this moving faster?" That voice doesn't disappear just because you become more aware. It lingers. Subtle, but persistent. It questions the process. It questions the timing. It quietly suggests that maybe something isn't working. And interestingly, it often grows louder in stillness. When there's no immediate result, no clear sign of progress, the mind begins searching for answers. It tries to fill the silence with conclusions. Maybe the effort wasn't enough. Maybe the approach was wrong. Maybe this won't work at all. And just like that, the old pattern starts to return. The urge to control creeps back in. The impulse to push harder, to adjust more aggressively, to speed things up in any way possible. It feels logical, even necessary. But underneath it, if you look closely, there it is again, tension. The same tension as before, just wearing a different disguise. What makes this stage especially difficult is that, from the outside, nothing looks wrong. You've taken the right steps. You've shown up consistently. You've stayed focused and committed. And yet, the results aren't matching your expectations. That gap, between effort and outcome, is where patience is tested the most. Not when everything is falling apart, but when things are simply not moving as quickly as you want them to. And in that space, it becomes incredibly easy to misread delay as failure. To assume something must be fixed immediately, even when, in reality, nothing is actually broken. This is where the idea of timing stops being theoretical and becomes something you have to live through. Growth doesn't always show itself in obvious ways. Sometimes, it's happening quietly beneath the surface, out of sight. Skills are developing. Perspective is shifting. Awareness is deepening. But because none of these changes produce instant, visible results, it can feel like nothing is happening at all. And that feeling creates pressure. Pressure to act. Pressure to change something. Pressure to do anything, just to create the sense of movement. But here's the question. Is all movement truly progress? And is all stillness really stagnation? Not necessarily. There's a deeper truth here. Meaningful things don't appear all at once. They unfold over time. Not because they're being withheld, but because they're being built in layers that can't be rushed. Think of it like a structure. Before anything can rise, a foundation has to be laid. And that foundation takes time to stabilize. If you try to rush it, you don't strengthen it, you weaken it. And this is where the real challenge appears, because the world around you constantly promotes speed. Immediate results, quick success, fast progress. Everywhere you look, there's pressure to move faster, achieve sooner, arrive earlier. So when your experience doesn't match that pace, it creates a quiet but powerful feeling, the feeling of falling behind. But is that feeling actually true? Or is it coming from comparison? More often than not, it's the latter. You're measuring your progress against timelines that may not even apply to your situation. Standards that weren't designed for your path. Expectations that don't reflect your reality. And when you start to see that clearly, something shifts again. And as you begin to see that your timing isn't meant to match anyone else's, something inside starts to settle. In that realization, you stop overlooking a simple truth: your path has its own rhythm. It doesn't need to mirror anything outside of it. And once you begin to accept that, patience starts to feel different. It no longer feels like waiting in frustration. It begins to feel like allowing things to unfold at the pace they're meant to, without constantly stepping in to interfere. Allowing yourself to keep showing up, even when there's no immediate proof that it's working. And in that shift, a significant amount of pressure begins to fall away. You're no longer trying to force results into existence. Instead, you're creating the conditions for results to emerge naturally. And those conditions aren't built overnight. They're built through consistency, through clarity, through time. At the same time, a different kind of trust begins to form. Not blind optimism, not passive hope, but something more grounded, a quiet trust in the process itself. You begin to understand that not everything needs to be controlled for progress to happen. Your role becomes clearer. It's to act, to stay aligned, to refine your approach when needed, but not to dictate the exact moment when everything should come together. That part was never yours to control. And when that truly sinks in, the tension around timing starts to loosen. It doesn't disappear completely. Impatience still shows up from time to time. But now, it doesn't control you the way it used to. You notice it. You understand it. And instead of reacting to it, you let it pass. You stay steady. You keep moving forward, even when there's no immediate reward, no visible sign of progress. And over time, that steadiness becomes one of your greatest strengths. Because while others rush, react, and burn out trying to speed everything up, you're building something different. Something sustainable. Something that doesn't depend on constant validation or quick outcomes. And when results finally do appear, they carry a different kind of weight. Not because they came quickly, but because they were built on a foundation that wasn't rushed, forced, or compromised along the way. At some point, without any dramatic moment or clear signal, the shift begins. It doesn't arrive as a sudden breakthrough. It builds quietly, through small changes in how you think, how you act, and how you relate to what you're pursuing. What once felt like chasing starts to feel unnecessary. That constant urgency, that pressure to get somewhere as fast as possible, begins to lose its grip. And in its place, something steadier begins to take form. Not slower in a negative way, but more deliberate, more grounded, more aware of what truly matters, and what doesn't. Because chasing always carries a certain kind of energy. Look closely, and you'll see it's often driven by fear. Fear of missing out. Fear of falling behind others who seem to be moving faster. Fear of not being enough as you are right now. And because it's rooted in fear, it creates urgency. It pushes you to act quickly, sometimes before you've had the chance to think clearly. It makes everything feel immediate, as if every decision carries weight that demands instant action. But that urgency comes at a cost. It pulls your attention in too many directions at once. It makes it harder to focus, harder to stay clear, harder to move with any real sense of stability. And when you're in that state, your actions begin to reflect that pressure. You might take on things that don't truly align with what you want, simply because they look like opportunities you can't afford to miss. You might say yes when you should say no, just to keep momentum going. You might rush decisions that would have benefited from a little more time, a little more reflection. Over time, that creates a scattered kind of movement. You're doing a lot, but not always moving in a meaningful direction. There's effort, but not always clarity. Motion, but not always progress. Alignment feels completely different. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand immediate results. It begins with clarity. You know what you're doing, and more importantly, you understand why you're doing it. That clarity becomes a filter. It helps you recognize what truly fits, and what doesn't. It allows you to move forward without feeling the need to grab onto everything that comes your way. And because of that, your actions become more focused. You're no longer reacting to every possibility that appears. You're choosing, deliberately, based on what actually aligns with your direction. And that shift, from reacting to choosing, changes everything. And as you begin choosing alignment over reaction, something becomes noticeably quieter within you. There's less noise, less second-guessing. You're no longer constantly wondering if you're missing something or falling behind. Instead, your attention settles into what you've consciously chosen to focus on. You're engaged, fully present with it. And that engagement creates a sense of stability that feels different, more grounded. You're still moving forward, still making progress, but without that underlying tension that comes from trying to keep up with everything at once. There's no frantic energy pulling you in multiple directions. Just steady movement. And from that stability, something else begins to improve. You think more clearly. You act with more precision. You can adjust when needed without feeling like everything is at risk. There's space between stimulus and response now. Space to choose. There's an idea that captures this perfectly. If you don't know where you're going, no wind will ever feel favorable. Without clarity, every direction feels uncertain. Every opportunity feels urgent. And instead of progress, you get confusion. But when you're aligned, that changes. You know your direction. You don't need every opportunity to work out. You only need the ones that actually move you closer to where you're going. And suddenly, decision-making becomes simpler. Not because choices disappear, but because your perspective becomes clearer. As this way of moving becomes more natural, you start to notice something surprising. Just how much energy was being wasted before, not only in your actions, but in your thoughts. The constant comparison. The pressure to keep up. The need to be everywhere, do everything, catch everything. It all begins to fade. And in its place, there's a quieter, more focused kind of awareness. You still notice what's happening around you, but it doesn't pull you off course so easily anymore. You remain centered in what you're doing. And that consistency starts to build momentum in a completely different way, not through speed, but through direction. At the same time, a new kind of confidence begins to form, not the kind that depends on quick wins or external validation, but something deeper. A confidence rooted in knowing that you're moving in a way that actually makes sense for you. Your decisions feel more solid because they come from clarity, not urgency. And because of that, you feel less need to constantly check, adjust, or seek reassurance. You're no longer looking for confirmation at every step. You're moving forward based on understanding, not insecurity. That doesn't mean everything suddenly becomes easy. Challenges still appear. Uncertainty is still there. But your relationship with those challenges changes. They don't shake you the way they used to, because your movement is no longer tied to reacting to every external shift. It's anchored in something more stable. You can adapt without losing direction. You can adjust without feeling like you're starting over. And over time, that makes the entire process feel far more sustainable. As this continues, the difference between chasing and aligning becomes impossible to ignore. Chasing drains you. It scatters your energy, pulling you in multiple directions without a clear purpose. Alignment, on the other hand, supports you. It guides your actions in a way that feels consistent, intentional, and grounded. And once you've experienced that difference, it's hard to go back. Not because you're forcing yourself to avoid urgency, but because it simply no longer feels necessary. What remains is a way of moving that is both calm and deliberate. You're still pursuing what matters to you, but without that constant fear driving every decision. You're not trying to control every outcome. You're focusing on your direction, your actions, your presence, and in that space, progress begins to feel different. It's not rushed. It's not forced. It's steady, clear, built on something that doesn't collapse under pressure. At some point, this can feel almost counterintuitive. Everything you've been taught suggests that more effort should always lead to better results. That pushing harder should bring things closer. That intensity is the way forward. And yet, the more pressure you apply, the more things seem to blur. Your decisions become less clear. Your reactions become faster, but not necessarily better. It's as if the very thing you believe is helping you is quietly working against you. And that's where the shift toward calm starts to make sense, not as something passive, but as something far more effective. Because tension narrows your perception. When you're anxious, your focus tightens. It becomes almost tunnel-like. You start looking for quick fixes, immediate answers, anything that can relieve the discomfort of uncertainty. But in doing that, you miss what exists just outside that narrow view. Opportunities that don't match your immediate expectations get overlooked. Signals that require patience to recognize go unnoticed. And your decisions start coming from urgency instead of clarity. You're still moving, but not always moving well. In contrast, when your mind is calm, something opens up. And that difference, as you start to see, isn't about what they have. It's about how they relate to it. It shows up in the way they approach everything in front of them. They don't enter each situation with the need to control every detail. They don't treat outcomes as something that must unfold in a specific, predetermined way. Instead, they rely on something far more stable, their ability to respond, no matter what happens. And that quiet trust changes everything, even before anything actually unfolds. There's a calm confidence in that approach. Not loud. Not something they try to prove. Just steady, grounded, almost unshakable. It doesn't come from believing life will go exactly as planned. It comes from knowing that even if it doesn't, they'll still be able to handle it. That understanding lifts a surprising amount of pressure. They're not trying to remove uncertainty from life. They're moving through it without letting it control how they think or feel. And because of that, they remain open in ways most people aren't. And that openness matters more than it seems. It allows them to notice opportunities that don't fit into rigid expectations. It allows them to adjust when things shift, instead of resisting those changes. It allows them to stay fully engaged with what's happening right now, instead of constantly looking ahead, searching for reassurance that everything will work out. Over time, that openness creates a completely different experience. Life stops feeling so tight, so constrained. There's more space to move, to grow, to explore possibilities that weren't part of the original plan. Things begin to unfold in ways that feel less forced and more natural. Carl Jung once pointed out something powerful. What you resist doesn't just remain, it grows. And you can see that clearly here. When you approach life with tension, trying to control every outcome, you unintentionally amplify the very uncertainty you're trying to eliminate. Every small shift starts to feel significant. Every delay begins to feel like something is going wrong. And that resistance builds a quiet, but constant internal pressure, one that slowly makes everything feel heavier than it actually is.